Buonasera a tutti, oggi abbiamo il piacere di intervistare Lawrence Reed, che è stato l'ex presidente del Magnet Center for Public Policy dall'87 al 2008, poi è diventato il presidente della leggendaria Foundation for Economic Education, che è una delle istituzioni più rinomate degli Stati Uniti in ambito economico, dal 2008 fino all'anno scorso, 2019, e dall'anno scorso ad oggi è il presidente emerito della stessa Foundation for Economic Education. Ha prodotto un suo libro, The Great Myths of the Great Depression, in italiano la Verità sulla crisi del 29, che è un libro veramente coinvolgente, che parla di cosa è successo, cosa ha causato la crisi del 29, perché è stata così grave, perché è stata così pesante, e lui un po' debunka questi miti che sono stati ripetuti negli ultimi decenni. Quindi io lo introdurrò adesso, inizierà una lezione di 30 minuti e dopo apriremo per le domande. Potete aprire le domande direttamente sulla chat, io le leggerò e lui le risponderà a fine lezione. Hello Mr. Reed, it is a pleasure having you today to talk to you about the great myths of the Great Depression. And I think everyone here is very happy and very enthusiastic about this lesson.
Thank you very much, Edson, and thanks to the Institute. This is a great honor for two reasons. One, because I believe very much in the good work that the Institute does to spread ideas of liberty and free markets, and then also to be introduced by a Brazilian from a country that I also have strong connections to and have traveled widely in. This is terrific. So I really appreciate it. And I can't tell you how many times I've been to Italy and have loved every travel there, especially in the northern part. Just 2 years ago to the Dolomites, and from Milan, took a train to Switzerland, and did a lot of other things in the northern part, near Lake Como and so forth. So you're bringing back a lot of memories. Well, I'm happy to talk to you today about the Great Depression. This will be from largely an American perspective. I know that the Great Depression affected many countries in the world, and surely Italy as well, but I'm not as intimately knowledgeable with the politics and the economics of other countries as I am, of course, America. So maybe some of what I say you can extrapolate or apply to Italy, but I'll leave that to you. The Great Depression was not the first depression in American economic history. It certainly was the longest and the deepest, and that's why we call it the Great Depression. But we'd had other depressions before, and every single one of them was preceded by a period of monetary and credit expansion that fueled a boom to one degree or another. And then when that policy shifted to either stability or actual contraction of the money supply, the boom ended and there was a correction, which we call a depression. So the difference primarily between the Great Depression and the ones in American history that came before it is its depth and its length. All the previous depressions in American history were over with in a few cases less than a year, or maybe 2, the maximum 3 years duration. But the Great Depression lasted at least 12 years. And that's the standard explanation. The conventional history texts tell you, oh, it was a 12-year experience from 1929 to 1941. But I will make the case in this lecture that I think it was longer than that we really didn't get general recovery for the average citizen anyway until 1945, which makes it a 16-year depression. Well, that's 5 times longer than any depression that came before. And that fact cries out for an explanation. Why was this one so long? It was also the deepest depression in American history, as measured by things like industrial production. The decline in that was horrific, about 50% from the top to the bottom. And unemployment was the worst in American economic history. It was At its height, it was about 27, 28%. These are factors that cry out for a special explanation. Why did the Great Depression last so long? And why was it so deep? Well, I think the best way to explain it is to consider it not as one 12-year or 16-year lump of economic activity, but rather think of it as a long episode that was punctuated by 4 distinct phases. Phase 1, and I'll give you the name of it in just a moment. Phase 1 will explain why the Depression began. What were the factors that led to it, that made it begin? And then the subsequent phases, 2, 3, and 4, will explain what kept the economy from recovering, what made it worse for a time, what made it so long. There are 4 distinct phases of this critical episode in American history. The name of the first phase is the monetary. Sometimes we call it the financial phase of the Great Depression. You can see by either name that it has something to do with money and credit, whether you call it the monetary or the financial phase. And earlier, at the start of this talk, I mentioned that depressions are typically preceded by a period of inflation of money and credit and a boom, which then gets burst, right? It's like a bubble that gets burst, and then you have a downturn. Well, you see this very much again in the lead up to the Great Depression beginning in 1929. Now, there were some good things happening during the 1920s. I don't want you to think that the only thing that was happening was an inflation of money and credit that made a corrective depression inevitable. There were some good things that made for a healthy economy. Woodrow Wilson was gone from the White House. He left the presidency after a second term in 1921, and we returned to what Americans at that time called an era of normalcy. And there are a number of ways in which you can explain that. It seemed like more normal times because, economically speaking, tax rates came way down. Under the administration of Warren Harding, followed by his vice president, who became president, Calvin Coolidge, tax rates that had been raised to incredible highs under Woodrow Wilson. The top rate was raised under Wilson to some 73%. That came down by 2/3. And that was very helpful. At much lower tax rates, both the top income categories saw substantial rate reductions, and the lower income levels also saw even more substantial reductions in tax rates percentage-wise. Well, that's a good thing because that helped to spur investment and confidence. It prompted people to expand their factories and hire more people, and it made economic activity more profitable. And it attracted foreign investment from overseas because people thought, wow, if tax rates are so low and now the American economy is booming, let's put our money there. So we had a lot of incoming investment in the 1920s. That's a good thing. And under Calvin Coolidge, who became president in 1923, he curtailed government spending. He reduced the size of the bureaucracy. He cut the national debt by, I think it was almost half. Those are all healthy things that freed up resources for the economy to recover from the recession that came after World War I. But the bad thing that was happening, and which contributed to the coming of the Great Depression, was on the monetary front. What the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, was doing. From 1924 to early 1929, the Federal Reserve was busy expanding money and credit at a very feverish pace. The economist Murray Rothbard of the Austrian school, same school of thought that I'm from, he argues in his book, America's Great Depression, that the rate of increase in money and credit in that 5-year period, 1924 to 29, was about 66% by one important measure. Other economists say, well, no, that's a little high. Maybe it was only 40% or 45%. That's not a big difference. But the bottom line is that easy money, whether the rate of expansion was 40 or 50 or 60%, Easy money drove interest rates to artificial lows. The banks were flush with funds. They were lending it out. People were borrowing. Businesses especially were borrowing at these lower rates and putting the money to work in primarily in capital goods industries, where you see a feverish expansion in the mid to late 20s. And that's the bad part of the 1920s. We call that period the Roaring 20s because there was such a boom going on. The lower tax rates, good thing. They were creating all kinds of new enterprises, and we had a cascade of inventions and great increases in productivity, and it was a wonderful time in many respects. But beneath the surface was this poisonous, unsustainable expansion of money and credit that would have to be paid for sooner or later by a correction. If we had time, we could go into the Austrian trade cycle theory in more detail, but let me just say that that's the theory that I'm using to explain the coming of the Great Depression. And in a nutshell, the Austrian theory says that depressions are not inherently a part of the free economy. Rather, they are the result of outside interference in the form of easy money by the government monetary authorities, which stimulates a boom, just like we had in the United States before 2008, with dirt cheap interest rates, easy money, lots of expansion of money and credit by the Federal Reserve. It was doing that same thing in the 1920s. It was only a matter of time before the unsustainability of that would become apparent. Well, in fact, it was in early 1929 that the Federal Reserve itself began to reverse its policy. Now, think of an economy as a kind of house of cards propped up by all this easy money. That's not a healthy situation, but it's not laissez-faire either. This is government intervention in the form of inflationary monetary policy. That's what we were doing in the 1920s. And when the Federal Reserve reversed itself and began to not just slow the growth of money and credit, but actually to contract it, it was knocking the bottom layer out from under the house of cards. The whole edifice had to come down at some point. And at first, not many people saw this change in policy. The average American, well into 1929, was still thinking, wow, we're having such great times. But the smart money, those investors who are very savvy, they look at things like monetary policy, maybe what Congress is doing, maybe trade flows between countries, international events. They see changes in those things usually sooner than the average citizen does. And as the smart money, like the Bernard Baruchs, the Joseph P. Kennedys, into 1929, they saw first the change in monetary policy. They said, uh-oh, the Fed was spiking the punch at the party, and now they're taking the punch away. And so things are not going to keep going up and up and up. It's time to get out now. The pressure of that smart money, selling their stocks, selling other financial instruments, put pressure on the stock market in particular. And the market peaked out in very early September 1929 and had a lot of bad days before late October. But it was on October 24, 1929, when we had Black Thursday. That was a huge stampede, a sell-off in the stock market, and a big crash in one day. Now, again, we'd had 6 weeks of declining markets and some really bad days, but not as bad as that one. What happens on the 24th of October is that the not so smart money finally catches on. The smart money had bailed out before, but now the average American saw the handwriting on the wall and started dumping their stocks. And with that stampede, you had a dramatic plunge in the stock market. Some people say, well, that's why we had a Great Depression, because the stock market fell apart. But that is a very superficial explanation. The movement of the stock market, first up dramatically for several years and then down sharply, that was a symptom of the erratic monetary policy at the Federal Reserve. The stock market was reflecting what the Fed was doing. The Fed was raising interest rates, choking off money and credit. In fact, it will continue to do that from 1929 to through 1932. Even as prices were tumbling in those years, the Federal Reserve continued to tighten, raise its interest rates dramatically. In fact, if you have falling prices at the same time you have rising interest rates, that means that the real impact of interest rates is even more dramatic, because if prices are falling, rates are rising, you get a double whammy, you might say. You get hit at both ends. And so it was Federal Reserve policy that helped to stimulate a false and unsustainable boom. It was the dramatic change in its policy that led to the collapse of the stock market and the general economy. But even so, in the spring of 1930, we didn't yet have a depression. This is several months after the big crash, May, June of 1930. The stock market actually, after those bad weeks in October and November and December, it actually had begun to rise again. It had regained half of the ground that it had lost. And unemployment wasn't yet at depression levels. It was only about 8.5%. Most economists say we don't consider it a depression until you have 10% or more unemployment, but we didn't have it yet. So in the late spring of 1930, months after the stock crash, we still didn't have a depression. We had a recession, but not a depression. Now, I've just explained to you what started this economic downturn. Now let me get to the second phase of the depression, which will tell you why we went from a bad situation to much worse. And the name for the second phase is the disintegration of the world economy, the disintegration or the falling apart of the world economy. It begins in June of 1930. Now, again, keep in mind what I just said about the situation in late spring of 1930. We didn't have a depression yet, but we had annoyingly high unemployment, and Republicans were in charge of the Congress and the White House under President Herbert Hoover. And they were going into midterm elections in November of 1930, and they saw these unemployment rates of 8 to 9%, and they said, we got to do something about that. And historically, certainly back then and in the 19th century, the Republican Party was always the party of high tariffs, of protectionism. So President Hoover and the Congress, mostly the Republicans, looked around and they said, well, we have to get these unemployed Americans back to work. So let's impose higher tariffs. The idea there was, if we put tariffs on foreign goods and make them high enough, well, then foreigners won't be able to sell here. And what will Americans do? Well, they'll buy American-made goods, and that'll put those unemployed Americans back to work. That was the idea, anyway. Raise tariffs to close off foreign imports so that Americans would then have to buy American goods and put more people to work in American factories. They passed in June of 1930, to accomplish that, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, S-M-O-O-T H-A-W-L-E-Y, Smoot-Hawley Tariff. I know that the Institute is putting a link, or has a link on its site to my essay, which will go into this in much more detail if you care to read it. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff raised tariffs on foreign goods to an all-time high, and it virtually closed the borders. And of course, it didn't have the effect that the politicians thought it would, because they didn't understand that trade is ultimately a two-way street. You can't close the door to imports without sooner or later, and usually very quickly, closing the door to exports. Think of it this way. If foreigners cannot sell to you because your tariffs on their goods are so high, well, then how can they earn your currency? How can they earn the dollars that they need to buy in the case I'm talking about in America? So foreigners, they said, well, we can't sell to you because your tariffs are so high, and now we can't earn dollars to buy from you. So the boat that never comes from Japan with goods of one kind or another never leaves America with soybeans and wheat and other things, mostly agricultural products that they used to buy. Now, this would be true. That is, that export industries would be hard hit, just as imports are. And that would be bad enough. if that's all that happened. But typically, protectionism doesn't, it changes things across the board. It prompts other countries to do the same. And so what happens in 1930 is that Smoot-Hawley prompts a trade war. Foreign countries say, okay, you're going to do that to us, we're going to do it to you. So they raise their barriers against American goods. So we got hit both ways. The direct impact of closing the border to our trading partners, and the impact of trading partners closing their borders to our goods. And so any industry that depended upon world trade, export or import, in the early 1930s in America and beyond, really got hit hard. In America, the number one industry for export at that time was agriculture. About a third of what American farmers were growing was being sold in overseas markets. And now those foreigners can't buy from us because our tariffs prevent them from selling here. And so American agriculture goes into a tailspin. Thousands upon thousands of farmers go off the farms in bankruptcy. Farm prices plummet. There are old newsreels you can watch today, black and white, that show farmers dumping milk into ditches and killing off large numbers of baby animals because it didn't pay to raise them to maturity, because prices had fallen through the floor. And of course they are. You have two factors at work here causing farm prices to plummet. You've got the effect of the tariffs, wiping out a big chunk of agriculture's overseas markets. But then you also have the Federal Reserve contracting the money supply, which is prompting sky-high interest rates. Farmers, are always borrowing money. Now their interest rates are going through the roof, and prices are plummeting for the things that they grow. So an agricultural depression occurred very quickly. By the end of 1930, we had clearly gone from a recession to a full-scale depression with double-digit unemployment that was approaching 20%. Well, there's another thing that happens in this second phase that is not really related to world trade. It's a exclusively American policy, but it happens before the third phase, so I throw it in here for quick discussion. And this happens in 1932. In 1932, as you can imagine now, with 20+% unemployment, the revenues to the federal government in Washington are way down. People aren't paying taxes, they're broke, they're unemployed, companies are out of business, so tax revenues to the government decline. But Herbert Hoover was not a laissez-faire small government guy. He was spending more than ever before. He had his bailout schemes and his subsidies and so forth, trying to prop up an economy that was made sick in part by his policies and that of the Congress. So they thought, well, we got to do something about this deficit in the federal budget, because revenues are way down, our spending is way up, and now we have this massive deficit. We have to do something. Well, you can do something by cutting your spending to meet the shortfall, but that's not what they did. Instead, in 1932, they passed the Revenue Act. It's formally called the Revenue Act of 1932, which doubled the income tax. Now think about that. You're already flattened by Smoot-Hawley, the tariff, by the Federal Reserve contracting the money supply, by the collapse in world trade, falling prices across the board. And now, if you're lucky enough to still be in business, now you get your income tax dramatically raised. The top income tax rate was raised from 25 to 64% all of a sudden. That's one of the dumbest things to do in the face of a depression, but that's what they did. And it didn't fix the deficit. It only made it worse. It drove more people into unemployment. It caused more businesses to slow their growth or shut down entirely. So it was a very bad thing, but that's part of the second phase too. And as you can see so far, what I've described is not laissez-faire. It's not free market economic policy, and yet free markets and capitalism often get the blame for the Great Depression. But that's nonsense. Government was not the innocent bystander. It was the principal cause of all these calamities. And now we come to the third phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the New Deal. That's what we call this third phase, the New Deal. Now, you probably know that phrase, New Deal, is the name given to Franklin Roosevelt's package of economic legislation that he pushed through the Congress in the first part of his term. He was elected in 1932. He beat the incumbent, Herbert Hoover. And by the way, I should tell you, maybe you've heard it in Italy too, that supposedly Franklin Roosevelt ran on a big government platform, and Herbert Hoover was that laissez-faire small government guy who deserved to be thrown out of office. But during that campaign of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt attacked Herbert Hoover for, quote, presiding over the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. And he was right. I mean, he wasn't accusing Hoover of being a laissez-faire president. He was accusing him of taxing too much, spending too much, choking off world trade. If you believed in small government in 1932, you would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt because that's what he promised. It's not what he gave us when he got elected, but that's what he promised. In fact, the Democratic National Platform on which he ran in 1932 specifically called for a 25% reduction in federal spending. 25% reduction in federal spending. When he became president, he doubled spending in the first term. He didn't cut it at all. And also his running mate, running for vice president, John Nance Garner, he accused Hoover of leading the country down the path to socialism, which was right. But, you know, historians, so many leftist historians today tell you just the opposite, because that's the more convenient narrative that suits their personal agendas, but it's not historical fact. So Roosevelt wins in a landslide. He takes office in March of 1933, and he pushes through Congress a whole bunch of bills called the New Deal collectively. And I just want to focus on two, the most important two bills that became law during the New Deal. And as you'll see in a moment, these two laws made things even worse. They're major factors in preventing economic recovery. Even though Roosevelt gets credit for, you know, oh, didn't he save us from the Great Depression? No, he actually prolonged it by 7 years. Here's what the first of those two things did. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Got a great name. Who wasn't in favor of industrial recovery in the midst of a depression? But Roosevelt's people thought that the problem was that there was too much competition in the economy. They thought, you know, look at prices. They're down across the board. And every time some business is able to get its prices up a little bit, somebody comes along and undercuts it and prices go back down. We need to get prices to stay up. Well, if only they'd understood that the Federal Reserve's tight monetary policy was the main instrument for those falling prices. And close behind was the choking off of world trade through the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. But they decided, well, let's attack this price problem. The NIRA imposed price controls on the American economy to try to force prices up to prevent them from falling. In fact, there's a famous case involving a man who was a tailor, you know, making suits of clothes, and he was prosecuted under the NIRA for pressing a suit of clothes for 35 cents instead of the government mandated price of 40 cents. Okay, now think about this. You're in the midst of a depression. You're lucky if you have a suit to even have pressed. And you take it to Jack Magid, that was his name, and you say, hey, Jack, can you press my clothes? And he says, yeah, I'll do it for 35 cents. And then the cops show up and take him to jail because he didn't charge you 40 cents in the name of economic recovery. I mean, this is ridiculous. One man's price is another man's cost. So even if this had helped some sellers of goods or services, it can only have done so at the expense of the buyers of goods and services. This is redistribution by stupid mandated price controls. it raised the cost of doing business on average by some 40% throughout the economy. And that's the last thing you need in a Great Depression, to have the costs of doing business going up, squeezing what few profits you have. That's what the NIRA did. At the same time, Congress passed Roosevelt's proposed Agricultural Adjustment Act. And like the NIRA, it thought, or the people who pushed it thought, that the problem was falling prices in agriculture. So they wanted to help the farmer by forcing prices up. But here's what the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, how it attempted to accomplish that. It imposed a new tax on agriculture, the last thing a sick economy needs, a new tax, and then used the money to pay for the destruction of perfectly good fields of corn and wheat and soybeans and other grains, and the destruction of perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. In fact, under one order from the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, who will later be one of Roosevelt's vice presidents, one order, he ordered the destruction of 6 million baby pigs. Not because they were unhealthy, but only because he wanted to keep them off the market so that the price for the remaining pigs would be higher and the farmers would make more money. But of course, they have less to sell. So even if this had helped the farmer, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This, redistribution through destruction of things of value is today, as it was then, as it's always been, a lunatic idea. It's not a prescription for general economic recovery. It may help a few if they're lucky, but only at the expense of everybody else. Well, the economy under these two stupid laws continued in depression, but in 1936 and into 37, we actually saw some signs of recovery. Unemployment fell below 20%. What prompted those good signs, a turnaround in 36 and 37? Well, mainly it was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court came in and declared both of those two laws I mentioned, AAA and the Industrial Recovery Act, declared them both unconstitutional. And then, freed of the worst of FDR, the economy started to show some signs of life. But then in 1937, the middle part, we suddenly suffered a depression within a depression. In other words, that short-term, brief, mild recovery gives way to a renewed collapse, renewed depression. And unemployment soars again way beyond 20%. What happens to take an improving situation and make it even worse in 1937? Well, now we come to the fourth and final phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the Wagner Act, W-A-G-N-E-R, the Wagner Act. Now, I'll get to that legislation in a moment. It was clearly the most depressing factor in 1937. That's why we call the fourth phase the phase of the Wagner Act. But there were other factors. Roosevelt just won re-election in 1936. Easily, by a landslide. You have to give him credit. Nothing was working. The economy was still in bad shape, and yet he gets reelected. He gives these soothing speeches on the radio called fireside chats. And a lot of Americans thought, well, he's trying, let's give him another chance. So he gets reelected, and he decides to go after the Supreme Court. After the court had declared the NIRA and the AAA unconstitutional, he starts to call the 9 justices those 9 old men. How dare they throw out my best legislation? We got to get rid of them. But he can't call for their impeachment. They hadn't done anything illegal or unconstitutional. They actually rendered sound judgments and threw that nonsense out. So what he has to come up with is something creative, a court packing scheme. And it's been in the news again in America because Joe Biden has refused to rule out the possibility that he would pack the court if he's elected. But it goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, who proposed in 1937 a bill whereby for every Supreme Court justice who reaches the age of 70 and who does not retire voluntarily, the president would get to appoint one new one. And within a couple of years, looking back now, knowing who resigned and who died and so forth on the court, it would have meant that in about 2 years, Roosevelt could have appointed 5 new justices. And he would have picked the kind of cronies who would support his stuff. And so this was a depressing factor economically in 1937, because investors in particular, they said, oh my gosh, let's wait to see how this turns out, because if he gets his way and packs the court, all that New Deal nonsense is going to come back, and we can't invest in that kind of an environment. So it produced what historian and economist Robert Higgs calls regime uncertainty. So did other things that Roosevelt was doing, but this was a big factor in the Depression of 37. People said, stay out of the American economy until the Supreme Court packing thing is settled. Fortunately, Roosevelt's own party turned against him, and they defeated it. So he did not succeed in that. But he also, in that year, secured the passage of new and higher taxes. One was on so-called undistributed profits. He wanted a tax on undistributed profits, sometimes called retained earnings, profits that a company retains rather than paying out to shareholders, because it's an important source of capital for things like business expansion. He wanted a tax of 85% on retained earnings. And Congress, fortunately, didn't give him one that big. It only gave him a new tax of 35%, but that was bad enough. In 2 years, Congress will realize how harmful that was and repeal it. But in 37, it was a big factor in the decline of the economy. Roosevelt also was raising taxes every chance he got. Keep in mind, when he ran in 32, he accused Hoover of raising taxes and said that was a terrible thing. But before he's done, the top tax rate will be a historic 91%. He attacked Hoover for raising it from 25 to 64%, but Roosevelt will raise it to 91%. He also at one point proposed to Congress a 99% top rate on higher income people. And Congress refused to pass it. And then Roosevelt overrode the Congress and by executive order imposed a 100% income tax rate, 100% on all incomes over $25,000. That's horribly depressing. That means, hey, if you are lucky enough to make some money, say you made $25,000 and now you might in the next year make $30,000 if you're good on your investments. He wants all of it. He wants all of the income that you've earned over $25,000, all the additional $5,000. Well, nobody's going to take a risk of any kind. If the government says you take the risk, we take the reward, every penny of it. Fortunately, Congress overrode that, so it was not in existence very long, but it was a factor in the 1937 collapse. Now, I need to wind this up, and I still have to tell you about the Wagner Act. This gave enormous new powers to labor unions in America. It gave them rights to exclusive representation, so that if 50% plus one of the workers at a plant or factory vote for a union, then everybody can be compelled to join. It gave unions enormous new powers to organize, and they did, and they went on strike. This was the year of the sit-down strikes in the auto plants that shut down the state of Michigan because of the militancy of the labor unions. The effect of that was to dramatically raise the cost of labor, an important cost of doing business, and cause investors to say, we're getting out of here. So that was a very depressing factor and a big one in explaining the 1937 collapse. The American economy will continue to limp along with very little improvement until World War I began. And then all of a sudden, with American entry in December of 1941, you begin to see quickly a substantial decline in unemployment. And some historians say, so the Depression finally ended when we got into the war. It was the war that ended the Depression. If you look at things like consumption by ordinary people, if you look at standards of living, any measure of them, the average American did not see an improvement during the war years of 1941 to 45. They usually saw a decline from year to year. because we were rationing goods, we were building planes and bombs and tanks instead of refrigerators and automobiles. You can argue, well, we had to win the war, but don't confuse that with some kind of economic stimulus, because it comes at the expense of all the things that might have been produced that aren't, because we have to make war material. The unemployment rate fell, but that was largely because we drafted 11 million men into the military and sent them overseas, so they didn't count in the unemployment figures back in America. We really didn't see recovery for the average American until 1945, 46. And that was mainly for two reasons. One, the dramatic reduction in government spending. Now, you're probably thinking, what? I thought when you cut government spending, doesn't that cause the economy to decline? That's what Keynesians tell us. But here's an example of where, no, it doesn't. It frees up resources for the private sector to put to better use. And so all of a sudden, because of the demobilization of the war effort in 1945, with the war over, you had the release of resources for the private sector. And we saw a boom because of it. We started making refrigerators and automobiles and consumer goods again. And at the same time, in 1945, with Roosevelt having passed away in April, we had a new president, Harry Truman, who wasn't the radical New Dealer type that Roosevelt was. He gets rid of some of those Roosevelt appointees in high places. And he was actually pressured by Congress to pass into law in 1945 a dramatic reduction in the corporate income tax. It went from 90% on corporate earnings, business earnings, 90% to 38% overnight. Ask yourself, if you're a businessman and you're thinking, should I add another plant? Should I hire more people? Should I take a risk? Should I innovate? Or what should I do? If the government says, well, if you do and you make money, we're going to take 90%. But then the next day it says, oh, we're only going to take 38%. Yeah, that's going to change your behavior. You're going to think, well, I can take a risk at that rate, certainly more likely to than if they take 90%. Those are the factors that led to the recovery finally, more than anything else, although you also had the demand from European countries for American goods until they rebuilt their factories. That helped us as well. So with that, let me just conclude by saying anybody who can look at this record of the erratic monetary policy, the raising of tariffs and choking off trade, the Federal Reserve's crazy interest rate and monetary policies, the New Deal destruction of goods and services and price controls, and the Wagner Act raising the cost of labor, and the increased taxes from Franklin Roosevelt. Anybody who can look at that and say, oh, the Great Depression was caused by the free market, is just off the rocker. I mean, it's not true at all. It belies the actual history of the period. This was a failure of government intervention, big time. So thank you. I'll turn it over again to you, Edson. Sorry to go a little bit over.
No, it's very nice. I was laughing because you were talking about the 6 billion pigs, and I remind of a Brazilian politic of the 30s. It was this Great Depression, and the international prices of coffee were falling, and it was a very important commodity by the time. So they had this basic idea: why don't we buy all the coffee, excellent coffee, and burn it? And they started burning coffee for years and years, and they thought, "Oh my God!"
I not only remember hearing about that, I remember my professor of economics at my undergraduate school telling the story of a Brazilian student who came up after class one time, after my professor had lectured on the Great Depression and talked about our AAA, and the Brazilian student said to him, oh, you know what you said about destroying crops? We did that with the coffee crop in Brazil, and for the same reason. And my professor said to him, well, if destroying, he said, no, first he asked him, how did you determine what got burnt? And the student said, well, they don't do the same state every year. They burn this state, and the next year they burn another state. And so my professor said, well, if burning a state makes you wealthier, why don't you set fire to the whole country?
They should have done it, maybe. So the first question is, do you think any similarities between the situation of the Great Depression of '29 and the current
Good question.
situation?
There are always some similarities between one cyclical period and another, but also many dissimilarities. One of the similarities is that we certainly have easy money from the Federal Reserve. In fact, there's hardly any room for them to depress interest rates any further. They've been flooding the economy with easy money, and that particular tool to stimulate the economy, I think, only has a limited distance to go. So that's very similar, but similar also in that it just sets us up for some correction down the road. You don't know when it might come, but certainly at some point, if we see ever higher prices rising faster, the Fed will do what it always does, and it will reverse itself and start to contract money and credit, and almost as is always the case, it overreacts. It jacks up interest rates and contracts the money supply to a degree that then tips us into a corrective recession. So that element is still very much here. We are seeing some protectionism, and President Trump says he's not really a protectionist. He says, "Oh, I really want free trade," and the way to get there is through anti-free trade policy. If somehow they end up producing freer trade, I would be the first to cheer, but that's not usually what happens. So we are seeing a revival of that protectionism. But in other areas of, say, regulation, fortunately, there are dissimilarities where actually in the Trump administration, we've seen some substantial deregulation, not like the excessive regulation we saw under Obama and under Roosevelt. So there's both good and bad, but we certainly have not gotten off the roller coaster. At some point in the future, because of this easy money policy, there will be a correction. There will be a recession. It may be worse than that. We don't know. But I just wish we could get monetary policy fixed so that we quit this business of a roller coaster economy.
There's a second question very similar to the first one. It's asking about the current situation and the reaction of the global economy to the policies being implemented by almost all governments, and if there is a similarity between these policies and the 1929 crisis.
Yeah, central banks tend to act in relative unison, at least among the major trading countries. When America's pursuing an easy money policy, so is Europe typically. And so that's why these corrective recessions and depressions tend to be synchronous, you might say, relatively so. So I know that money has been easy in Europe. My guess is that China has been stepping on the gas too, because their economy has shown signs of weakness, and usually that's what the monetary authorities do. When they see a weak economy, they step on the gas again. I didn't make this analogy during the talk, but this is a good opportunity to do it now. It's often been said, I don't know who first said it, but that you can liken a boom and bust to the drunk or the man who goes to a party and drinks like a fish and becomes a drunk. And he's having a great time at the party because the alcohol is flowing freely. Well, that's like the easy money phase, the boom phase of the economic cycle. And then he stumbles home at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And when he wakes up a few hours later, he's got a terrible hangover, an awful headache. Well, if you saw him at that point, if you saw him in great agony the next day, I suppose you could say to him, "Hey, I can help you. One way is to give you another bottle. Here, drink another bottle or two of whatever you were drinking. You'll feel better again." Now, nobody would say that that's a long-term answer. That might make him feel better again for a while, but he's going to do damage to himself if he keeps resorting to that. He's going to kill himself. Or you could do the right thing and say to him, hey, sorry, the damage was done, not now. You're just feeling it. You're feeling the effects of it. The damage was done last night, and you did it when you were drinking like a fish. You're just paying the price for it now. So the best thing for you is to dry out. Stop doing what caused the problem in the first place. Let it work its way through your system and get back on a healthy basis and quit drinking. Okay, or at least quit drinking to excess. So when the government responds to a downturn by revving up the printing presses again, expanding money and credit, lowering interest rates, it's like giving the drunk another bottle. It doesn't solve a problem, maybe a short-term one or two, but it just sets you up later for another corrective downturn. That's that roller coaster that I spoke of. And every country, every major trading company or country in the world, I think, is doing that same sort of thing with its central banks. Short-term solutions that only cause long-term problems.
And the third question is, do you think Bitcoin will be a final solution to all this since governments cannot inflate it?
I certainly welcome the coming of digital currencies, Bitcoin in particular, because I see them as market alternatives that make it easier for people to conduct their transactions with confidence and in privacy. I think that's great for freedom and for the economy. And, it used to be that so many people, everybody thought that, oh, money, that has to be a government function. Nobody would know how to handle money except the government, even though they keep ruining it one time after another. So now we can point to things like Bitcoin and say, wait a minute, the competition in the private sector for even the production of money is entirely possible. In fact, governments don't invent money, they just take it over for their own selfish benefit at the expense of everybody else. So I welcome the coming of Bitcoin. I encourage people to use it if they choose to. Excuse me. I think I'm going to, pardon me. I think I've never sneezed during a lecture before. Now, how far it will go, how widely it will be used, will it be replaced by another digital currency? I don't know. But my view is let the market be free for people to choose alternatives. And if government ruins its money, at least there'll be something else to turn to that will be more reliable and privately issued.
There's another question. Is there a chance that the US dollar will return to being fixed on gold?
Oh,
gold standard.
Yeah, I'm a friend of gold, and I think it served us well. I don't see a return to the gold standard in any form on the near term. The reason that governments don't like gold is that they can't print it. And as long as they can still print it to bail themselves out of financial difficulties, that's the preferred route for government, even if it ends up harming everybody else. When a return to gold might happen, however, is if things get bad enough with fiat paper currencies that governments say, well, we have no choice. Nobody has any confidence in what we're printing anymore. So we have to back it with something. And historically, that's meant a precious metal. Let's do gold again. That would be good news. In fact, if the government asked me for my opinion today on this, I would say you're in trouble in the long run with your currency. And it would really be not only good for the rest of us, but good for you too, if you restored sound money, a metallic gold backing. But it wouldn't have any meaning in the face of a $3 trillion budget deficit, which is what we have this year, because the world would say you don't really mean it when you say you're backing the currency with gold. Because you're now fiscally sound, but you're running a $3 trillion deficit. It's only a matter of time before you start printing again. So you'd have to see, I think, a serious move to a balanced federal budget and other kinds of fiscal discipline before a gold standard would become feasible at all, or even on the table. But I think it's a good idea.
What do you think would happen to the U.S. economy if World War II had not occurred?
If what had happened, or
World War II had not occurred.
if World War II had not occurred, well, I think at some point, maybe in 1940, if there weren't war clouds gathering in Europe at that time, Roosevelt might have lost. And the American people might have said, you know, we had 2 terms of you and we're ready to try something different. 1940, and then even more so in 44, in the midst of the war, a lot of people thought, oh, well, we better stick with the guy we know instead of the one we don't, because the international situation seems so perilous. He might have lost in 1940. Now, the guy he ran against was not all that good either, but there were many good people in Congress, and if I'm pretty confident in saying that Roosevelt would not have won a 4th term. That would have been too much for the American people in the absence of an ongoing war. And so by 44, at least, we would have thrown him out, if not in 1940. And that could not have been anything but a good thing, even if he was replaced by not a real good president, because you couldn't get much worse than Franklin Roosevelt. The only one worse in our history, I think, was Woodrow Wilson. And without the war, I think we would have had economic recovery, but it would not have been because of the New Deal. It would have been because we would have gotten rid of Roosevelt and somebody else would have turned us in a different, less interventionist direction.
I had received this question whether Woodrow Wilson was almost as bad as Roosevelt, but you just answered it.
Yeah, I think I put him as the worst of all 45. Oh my gosh. Yeah, he was bad on everything.
Central banks are developing their own digital currencies, by the way. Will a further decrease in economic and personal freedom?
Oh, could you restate that, Edson?
Will it be a further decrease in economic and personal freedom since banks are developing their own digital currencies?
Okay, if I understand the question properly, I think a free and privately issued currency is an important pillar of a free society. And we will know for sure that we've made a lot of progress in convincing people that big government in their lives is a bad idea when finally we wrench control of money away from the government. And that could take the form of privately issued competing multiple digital currencies. Could even be in the form of metallic money with paper issued redeemable in metal. You know, a gold standard, for instance, doesn't necessarily mean that the only thing that we use as money, that the only thing that in our pockets as money are bits of gold and silver. No, on a gold standard, people may prefer to use paper, but they have confidence in the paper because it's a receipt for the real thing. They know they can get gold if and when they need it, if the currency is truly backed by a precious metal. So it's more convenient in that case. Gold standard can still mean the gold sits in the vault, but the paper is redeemable on demand in that. So I don't know what a world of true monetary freedom might look like. In fact, nobody should tell you in advance what they think it will be like, because nobody knows. But we do know that through the private provision of other goods and services and the competition between providers, you end up getting superior products, better service, more reliability. And you certainly don't have producers producing so much of their product that it becomes worthless in value, which is what governments often have done in history to their paper currencies. I don't know if I answered the question, but I hope I did.
How can we fight the common narrative that Franklin Delano Roosevelt saved the US economy?
How can you?
We fight the common narrative that Roosevelt saved the US economy.
How can we fight that common narrative? Boy, well, I think, years ago, I wrote that essay called Great Myths of the Great Depression precisely for this reason, because I thought the average American is probably not going to read a 400-page book on the Great Depression. I mean, we do need thorough, exhaustive, detailed, scholarly works in the hundreds of pages. But we also, to reach the ordinary citizen, have to present our case in a relatively quick and understandable fashion, a short essay. That's why I wrote that essay. I didn't want to make it 400 pages. I wanted something that the average person could read in any country. So, and I continue to address it, as others from our perspective have, in even shorter pieces. Take a little piece at a time. You could pick on the National Industrial Recovery Act and write a short essay just on that and show how stupid it was, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act and say, how could this help farmers when it's destroying their stuff? There are a lot of little pieces you could tackle during the period in short, understandable pieces. But I think we need to send students into classrooms armed with this differing perspective to challenge their professors and say, wait a minute, you didn't tell us about this, or what about that, or how does the destruction of crops and cattle make us better off? We let the professors teach this nonsense so often without challenging them. So to the extent we can give students, in particular, the intellectual armament they can take into the classroom and do battle with their professors, or at least their students, their fellow students after class, I think that'll help a lot. Oh, I lost the volume, Edson. I have no volume.
Sorry, I was muted. What
Okay.
opinion on the Fed's quantitative easing rounds, considering the Austrian business cycle theory?
What was the first part about the Fed?
The quantitative easing rounds.
Oh, quantitative easing. Yeah, that's the more recent term. And that sounds more technical and sophisticated than just running the printing presses, right? So it sounds like it must have some validity because it's technical sounding.
It's a nice way of burning coffee without everyone noticing.
That's right. Yeah. The politicians are good at that. They love to make take the worst thing and put slap a nice sounding name on it. Well, quantitative easing was nothing more than the Fed producing easy money, depressing interest rates artificially, setting us up for a quote recovery, but one that would carry the seeds of eventual correction. It shouldn't be thought of as a long-term sustainable policy. And even the Fed didn't think of it as that way. They thought and continue to say, no, we just wanted to do it in a short run, and we'll be careful as conditions improve. We'll be quick to reduce our balance sheet and take all of that easy money back. Well, the verdict is not yet in on that as to what the long run effect of it is. But I think we should see the Federal Reserve for what it is, and that is it's a handful of people appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, who think they know far more than they do about what economic policy and what monetary policy should be like. I keep thinking back to that wonderful observation of F.A. Hayek when he said the curious task of economics is to convince men of how little they know about what they imagine they can design. Can you imagine? Here's a good way to illustrate this, I think. You pick another activity, say green beans. What if the government said, well, the supply of green beans needs to be properly regulated. So instead of having things in the market do it, that's chaos. We have to have the president pick 7 people to serve on a national green bean commission. And they will determine what the supply of green beans should be. And they'll regulate it so that if we have too many, they'll reduce the supply. If we don't have enough, they're going to sit around and figure out how many green beans do the people need or want. We would all laugh at that. We would say, what? That's nonsense. And so we don't have a green bean commission. And what do we have? You don't have to worry about going into the store and finding on one day, oh my gosh, the shelves are full of green beans. There's too much. They're everywhere. Nobody's buying them. And you don't have to worry about going in the next day and finding what's happened to the green beans. They're all gone. Now we have a shortage because prices, the market regulates the supply of green beans. And it does it so much more effectively than a handful of politically appointed friends of the president. I mean, that's so absurd. It's preposterous to think that these people could possibly know what they think they know about what the supply of money should be. It's ridiculous. They couldn't do it with green beans. They can't do it with money.
Italy is dominated by the idea of entrepreneurial state. What are the possible drawbacks that come from this idea?
Of entrepreneurial
State.
State. Oh, the idea that the state can be an effective entrepreneur, making investments, picking winners and losers, that kind of thing. Yeah,
Yes.
I think we need to attack that at its foundation. What is it about politicians or bureaucrats that should make them better entrepreneurs than people who are doing it with their own money? I mean, all the incentives within the public sector are in the other direction. And so that's why you see government, they tend to judge their success by, did they get the Congress to give them a bigger budget than last year? They don't have the same signals from the marketplace, from consumers, as to what is needed most urgently or more urgently than something else, and whether it's needed more here or there. It's the price system, a free price system that sends those signals. But when politicians get in charge, they're at sea without a rudder. They're not responding to genuine signals. They make investments that many cases they wouldn't do themselves if it was their own money. What does that say in itself? I mean, that should raise suspicions right there. Why should somebody who is spending somebody else's money that they got through gunpoint, why should you think that they would be a better investor, a smarter investor than people who have their own personal welfare on the line? I mean, I think it's ridiculous. The state as an entrepreneur, give me a break. That's like Dracula as a blood donor.
One last question. We're almost at 1 hour and 10 minutes, and it's are there any similarities between the Great Depression of 1929 and the housing crisis of 2008?
Yes, a lot of similarities. After 9/11 in 2001, the Federal Reserve was concerned about the economy, and rather than just leave it alone, of course, they got heavily into the business of easy money again. They drove interest rates to historic lows, and the initial effect of that was to create a booming economy. But at the same time, you had a lot of that easy money going in the direction of real estate because of stupid laws and executive actions of at least one or two presidents, where they said, oh, every American should be able to own a home. So let's make home ownership more affordable. Let's force the banks to make more home mortgages and to not have to not to require very much money down by the home buyer and so forth. A lot of that was forced on banks by stupid government policy. So what we had was much of the newly created easy money at these dirt cheap interest rates, unsustainable low interest rates, was going into the mortgage market, producing a bubble that burst when the Federal Reserve, beginning in 2007, turned around and started raising interest rates and choking things off. So it's the same old story, same old merry-go-round or roller coaster, I guess. Easy money causes a short-term boom, just like the drunk who feels good at the party, and then the next day you pay the price.
I have to thank you very much. I'm very happy. I personally, in the name of the Istituto Liberale, this was an amazing interview. I hope we can make it once more. Maybe here, maybe we can invite you to our national conference. And thank you very much, Mr. Reed.
My pleasure. Thank you, Edson, and thanks to the Institute. Keep doing the great work that you are, and I do hope to see you in person in Italy, or Edson, maybe you in Brazil at some point. So
maybe
thanks for what you do.
the next time.
Appreciate it. Goodbye.